Let's dive right into this explainer by confronting a really fascinating paradox. It was perfectly captured by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He famously said, "In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." Think about that for a second. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? We are talking about the United States military here, an organization that spends thousands of hours, assigns rooms full of absolutely brilliant analysts, and spends billions of dollars to wargame every conceivable scenario for years in advance. So why pour that staggering amount of resources into creating plans if the plans themselves rarely survive reality? Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're demystifying Joint Publication 5-0, which is the keystone doctrine for joint operation planning. We're going to see how the military uses planning, not as some rigid, inflexible script, but as the ultimate problem-solving framework for managing global chaos. Think of this process not as a set of handcuffs that bind a commander to a predetermined path. Actually, it's more like a massive intellectual engine. It's designed to help leaders think deeply through the absolute worst-case scenarios, so that when reality inevitably breaks the plan, they already have the tools to navigate the storm. So here's our roadmap for understanding this massive ecosystem today. First, the paradox of planning. Second, decoding strategic direction. Third, operational art and design. Fourth, the 6 phases of operations. Fifth, the step-by-step process. And finally, number 6, adapting to the chaos. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the paradox of planning, order from chaos. Because really, how do you plan for the truly unpredictable? That takes us to Section 2, decoding strategic direction, the blueprint. Okay, before you can plan a mission, you have to know what you're actually trying to achieve, right? And what's really interesting here is how grand, sweeping national policy gets translated into concrete, actionable instructions for troops on the ground. Think about a politician giving a speech saying, "We need a free and secure global environment." That's a great sentiment, sure, but how does a Navy captain or an Army general know what to literally do with that? To prevent getting lost in a massive bureaucratic alphabet soup, just remember that guidance flows downwards, kind of like a waterfall. It starts at the very top with the president's national security strategy. Then that gets handed to the Pentagon, which translates it into the National Defense Strategy and the Quadrennial Defense Review. Finally, it funnels all the way down into the guidance for employment of the force, which gives commanders their actual, tangible operational end states. This whole process acts as the critical connective tissue between a politician's broad vision and a commander's specific orders. Now, once a commander receives that strategic guidance, they have to visualize how to execute it. And this is conceptualized through a continuous, looping relationship of 4 key elements. We're talking ends, ways, means, and risk. You've got ends, what you want to achieve. Ways, how you're going to achieve it. Means, the resources you actually have at your disposal. And risk, which is the gap between what you have and what you want to do. If you manage a business, or honestly, even just a household budget, you intuitively understand this. Let's say your goal is to dominate a new market. That's your ends. But your funding gets slashed, your means. Well, your risk immediately shoots up, right? To bring that risk back down to an acceptable level, you either have to change your strategy, the ways, or just accept a more modest goal, lowering your ends. In the military, resource constraints are constantly pressing down from the top, and an unpredictable security environment pushes up from the bottom. Strategy is just a constant, unyielding balancing act of these exact 4 variables. Moving on to Section 3, operational art and design, the creative element. So, now we move to the creative side of the house. Before the spreadsheets and the rigid logistics planning even began, commanders use what the military literally calls operational art to conceptualize their broad approach. This is exactly where military strategy meets human creativity. The crucial starting point here: identifying the adversary's center of gravity, or COG. A center of gravity is basically the primary source of power that provides moral or physical strength. Now, in traditional conventional warfare, an enemy's COG might be their armored divisions, or their industrial base, maybe their capital city. But in irregular warfare, it might not be a military force at all. The center of gravity could simply be the enemy's legitimacy and influence over a local population. Imagine fighting an insurgency where dropping bombs actually alienates the locals. By destroying a physical target, you might accidentally strengthen the enemy's true center of gravity. If you don't correctly identify this, you can win 100 tactical battles and still lose the whole war. Right, so once you know the center of gravity, how do you attack it? Well, you rarely go at it directly. Instead, planners have to define decisive points. These are the specific geographic locations, critical events, or functions that allow a commander to gain a marked advantage. Think of decisive points as the individual dominoes you need to meticulously line up and knock over to eventually topple that center of gravity. You don't just win the war on day one.
First, you might need to secure a specific deep water port. Knocking over that domino allows you to bring in heavy equipment. That allows you to take out the enemy's communications grid, which in turn allows you to isolate their leadership structure. Planners map out these decisive points to create a deliberate, logical chain reaction of success.
Which brings us to Section 4, the 6 phases of operations, the spectrum of action. With that creative vision and those decisive points established, the military must arrange these massive complex operations sequentially. Why? To minimize cost and maximize impact. What's really fascinating here is how the military views the overarching timeline of a conflict. Hollywood movies usually only show us Phase 3 and Phase 4, seizing the initiative and dominating the enemy. Lots of explosions, right? But actual combat is just one small slice of a massive continuum. It all starts with Phase 0, shape. This is peacetime engagement. This is routine partnership building, joint training exercises, and sometimes literally digging wells to build goodwill. If shaping fails, you escalate to deter, and then the combat phases. But crucially, after the dominate phase, you don't just pack up your tanks and go home. You enter stabilize, and finally enable civil authority. The military dedicates an enormous amount of doctoral bandwidth to these final phases because they know for sure that planning for the peace is just as rigorous and just as important as planning for the war. All right, Section 5, the step-by-step process, the factory floor. Now we enter what I like to call the factory floor. This is the Joint Operation Planning Process, or JOP. This is where the creative operational design from the commander is handed over to a massive staff and turned into a detailed, executable step-by-step plan. And let me tell you, JOP is an intensely rigorous analytical cycle. Staffs do not just come up with one single idea and run with it. No way. They develop multiple, entirely distinct courses of action. Then, they sit down and ruthlessly wargame these options. They use red teams to play devil's advocate, simulating enemy responses to actively try and break their own plans. Once a plan survives that gauntlet, they have to align massive resources to support it. We're talking about monumental logistical puzzles here, like calculating exactly how many thousands of gallons of jet fuel need to be moved halfway across the world on what specific ships to arrive by a specific Tuesday. It's wild. So the reason this massive planning bureaucracy is so incredibly effective is that they operate with 2 distinct gears. In peacetime, they use deliberate planning to meticulously build contingencies for almost every scenario imaginable. But when a sudden crisis erupts, like a devastating natural disaster or a surprise attack, they shift gears into crisis action planning. Because of all that peacetime preparation, they rarely have to start from scratch. They simply pull a pre-built plan off the shelf, adapt a menu of existing options to the specific dynamics of the emergency, and execute in a fraction of the time. Think about how this applies to your own world. Having thoroughly researched contingencies prevents decision paralysis when everything is suddenly on fire. And finally, Section 6, adapting to the chaos, continuous assessment. So what actually happens when these heavily engineered, perfectly wargamed plans collide with the incredibly unpredictable reality of the real world? Well, the adaptive planning and execution system handles this by building an ecosystem of continuous assessment. It's not a straight line from planning to execution. It's a constant, infinite feedback loop. As the operational environment changes, as political realities shift, or as the enemy does something entirely unexpected, plans are fiercely evaluated. They're either revised, adapted, terminated, or executed. The plan is never just a printout sitting in a dusty binder. It's a living, breathing document that reacts to reality. If the enemy zigs, the plan must immediately adapt to zag. This brings us to a brilliant piece of wisdom from military historian B.H. Liddell Hart. This really serves as the ultimate philosophical anchor for military planners. He wrote, "An important difference between a military operation and a surgical operation is that the patient is not tied down, but it is a common fault of generalship to assume that he is." Just think about that for a second. You can never, ever assume your adversary or the political environment or the local population is going to sit perfectly still while you execute your meticulously crafted plan. The enemy always gets a vote. They will react, they will adapt, and they will try to ruin your perfect design. We've gone on quite a journey today. We've seen how the Joint Force takes grand national strategy, applies creative operational art to find the center of gravity, phases out operations from peace to war and back to peace, war games these massive logistical puzzles, and then commits to an infinite loop of reassessment. Which brings us to our final takeaway to leave you with today. If the most resourced, heavily structured organization on Earth realizes that true success lies not in rigidly following the plan itself, but in continuous, rapid adaptation, Is your own organization truly ready to adapt when the unexpected hits? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.